environment, more tools to take a look at. And two of the biggest ones are the PESTEL and the five forces. So the PESTEL, political, economic, socio-technological, environmental, and legal environment, it refers to a much broader environment. And one thing we have to recognize when we look at the broader environment of the organization is, if it changes based on your strategy, you have to relook at the environment. And I explain, for example, if you were a company that was operating strictly in Canada, then when you're looking at your PESTEL analysis, you'd be looking at the political environment of Canada, what might be changing in terms of regulations, policies, the economic environment, how our economy is doing, whether there's anything socially that's happening that might impact your strategy. However, let's say that you're that same company operating currently in Canada, but part of your options now are to look at expanding to the US, Europe, China, wherever it is that you think that there are areas of opportunity. That PESTEL environment will be much different in some of those other markets. So whatever you might be doing in terms of the current PESTEL for the organization, you might have to rethink what that PESTEL looks like if you're thinking of some options or some recommendations that are going to look at a quite different external environment for the firm. The second one is the five forces. So this is much more focused on the firm's current environment, and that was a Michael Porter tool that you look at the competition. Are there any substitutes for the products that you're selling, and how strong are those substitutes? So if something happens, customers are not happy, can they substitute for other things? And typically right now, because we're going through pandemic environment, there's a lot of things that people are using as substitutes for education, for the way that they conduct their overall life. So, some of those substitutes could stay in force way beyond the pandemic. And these are some of the things that you look at within the firm's environment in terms of the strength of those forces and what strategies you might employ in order to counteract the strength of some of those forces. So a couple of things I'd like to mention is when you look at, for example, the buyer force, you have to think in terms of who the buyer is. And sometimes whoever uses the product is not the buyer. If you think of baby products as an example, babies use the products, but the buyer is the mom and dad. And, so you have to think in terms of, who the customer versus the consumer is. And similarly, if you're a company that is selling to a reseller, then your buyer is that reseller, and then that reseller then sells to the actual market. So, you really got to think in terms of the strength of your force based on, who it is that you are selling to. So it's pretty, when you look through the book, it explains those five forces, suppliers, whether or not there's potential for new entrants. Those are all things that would affect how attractive that particular industry is, and, some of the things that you might employ to mitigate against some of those forces. Among some of the other things that you look at in the external environment is, how this environment or that force affects the firm. So, as I said earlier, what options to mitigate. And, there are a lot of opportunities. If I take an example, Southwest Airlines, when, one of the bigger problems from PESTEL was the price of fuel. So, one of the strategies that they employed was to hedge against fuel prices so that they would have a more even cost factor and better able to plan their strategies as a low-cost producer. So, if you look at right now the environment moving away from fossil fuels and toward greener um, energy sources, so some of the big gas companies are thinking in terms of, how they move away from fossil fuels and then start to gain some strength in some of the other sectors. So there's always all kinds of options to mitigate against even the worst of threats. The question is how seriously are you going to take these threats, and what efforts are you going to put behind drafting your strategy to move in the direction that will make you more sustainable. Another aspect of the external environment is competitors. So, what do you expect them to do? So, in terms of movement, so, that strategic group map allows you to look at your competitors from a strength perspective. So, how large are they? What kind of resources do they have? What types of core competencies? And what do you think, based on what they've done over the last 12 months, 24 months, where they might move going forward? And also, if you initiate a specific act, a strategic act, how are they going to react? And the example that I often cite is the one where at one point in time, Northern Ontario, there was a competitor that came in on the airline to compete against Air Canada, which was really pricing really high prices for travel out of, let's say, Timmins to Toronto. Would have been over $800. This was more than 20 years ago for a return flight. Whereas, this is a flight that could have easily been offered between $200 to $250 return. So when a competitor came in, smaller airline, and offered the lower prices, of course, Air Canada reacted with bringing their price down to the same level, except that they had the Aeroplan program that, people were very attached to getting their points. And so even though, it was to the consumer's benefit to support the competitive airline coming in at lower prices, they hung on with Air Canada. And of course, the competitor exited the market after a couple of years, and Air Canada brought their prices back up, so everybody lost. But, this is why it's very important to think in terms of, how strong, if your competitor is able to outmaneuver and have bigger pockets, they can outlast you in any offensive strike, then you've got to be really thinking in terms of how wise it is to enter against a giant that will react and possibly make your strategy unsuccessful. So, the external environment, again, what you want to do when you look at it is what does it look like now with the current products, services, and strategy that we're using. But if you're suggesting a movement away from the current strategy, whether it's new market segments or, whatever it is that you're proposing in terms of new moves, then you've got to relook at the external environment again and see, what it is that you have to do from an implementation perspective to make sure that your strategy is successful going forward. So to practice some of those concepts and tools that you're learning in the external environment, I did include a little bit of a case, which is an article about the clothing industry. And again, I think I mentioned before that this is an industry that's gone through a lot of upheaval, and this external environment analysis will allow you to look at, what are some possible options and opportunities going forward, perhaps in market segments, and what are some of the things that perhaps need to be avoided because of the consolidation and all of the things that are happening that make this segment less attractive. So good luck in going through that. Again, we have the discussion on Nexus